Hi, my name is Lydia Jankowski. I'm a junior at UMass Amherst, and today I'm presenting my honors thesis, Beyond the Studio, the role of artist studio complexes in 3 different Western Mass cities. I'd first like to thank my advisors, Dee Boyle-Clapp and Michael D. Pasquale, for helping me throughout this entire process. So to introduce my topic, for my research, I studied different artist studio complexes in East Hampton, Northampton, and Holyoke, Massachusetts. These were spaces in historic mill buildings that have been used and turned into artist studio spaces, as well as other mixed-use spaces. The main questions I wanted to address were, in what ways do artist studio complexes serve the artists that occupy space in them? And to what extent do these studio complexes benefit the communities and cities they occupy? Some of the objectives were to create recommendations that other post-industrial small cities could use to support the artists' communities within their cities. So the 3 different areas were Northampton, East Hampton, and Holyoke. You can see from this map, they're all adjacent to each other. And within the greater Western Mass setting, they are right in this lower portion. There's a lot of demographics, but I'll just highlight a couple. One thing to note is that Holyoke has a much larger Hispanic and Latino population due to their large Puerto Rican community compared to the other 2 cities, as well as a higher poverty rate compared to the other 2 cities. So the specific criteria for the artist studios I was researching was that they had to be in buildings with at least 3 studio spaces. Most of the times there's much more. They could be multi-use spaces, but their main mission had to be to provide space to artists in creative industries. And for this study, I specifically wanted ones that were in adapted mill buildings in post-industrial cities in Western Mass. So here we have just a brief overview of the different studios I studied. First, there's Brushworks Arts and Industry. This studio is in Northampton. Right over here, it's actually in the village of Florence. There's 4 floors, about 80 studios. This was established in the 1990s, and while there's studio space, there's also some light commercial and industrial use. Next, we have Eastworks in East Hampton. This is one of the larger buildings, over 200 units, 4 floors. They also have live workspace on the top floor. This was established in 1997 by a local East Hampton developer with his partner. And you have other mixed-use spaces like the R&V and different commercial restaurants. Also in East Hampton, we have Cottage Street Studios. This building is specifically for artist studios, although Riverside Industry owns the buildings and occupies part of it. They provide services to adults with mental disabilities and get them careers. In Holyoke, we have the Warrigan Building. This is a smaller studio complexes, but with larger studio units. It was established in 2009 by some partners from the California area. And we also have some mixed use in this space, but again, a lot of creative industry. Lastly, in Holyoke, we have the Baustein Building. This is about 220 studio units, 2 floors. It was established about 10 years ago in 2013, and we have mostly artist studio spaces in this building. So for my study, I had 3 different respondent categories. There were artists who were living and occupying and working in these spaces, community stakeholders, so anyone in the 3 cities who are residents, business owners, community organization members. We have policymakers, so people on the municipal staff who are planners, mayors, select boards, anyone who'd be willing to give their perspective on these spaces. So some limitations was the time frame, my own research capacity. It's hard to schedule interviews and get responses from people just because everyone is so busy. And I had selective recruitment, so I was looking for specific people who fit these specific roles, and it was often difficult to find people fitting those categories. On the right is an example of the flyer that I hung up in various public spaces around the different cities, as well as all the studio complexes. So for the actual research, in order to recruit participants, I sent emails using public directory information to different artists and policymakers, as well as hung up the flyer as seen above. And interviews lasted between 20 to 40 minutes. over the phone or Zoom, while the online questionnaire took about 10 minutes. Both the response formats had similar questions, but just different. You could respond via interview or via the online questionnaire. I had a total of 26 responses. The most were from East Hampton, but Holyoke had a significant amount of interviews, but no one from Holyoke responded via the questionnaire. So some of the findings, in the blues, you'll see some of the strengths and opportunities in each of these cities. And in the oranges, you'll see some of the threats and weaknesses. So in East Hampton, we have a really strong and robust municipal arts programming. East Hampton's really growing as a cultural scene, and they have really successful open studio events within their artist studio complexes. However, their success is almost getting ahead of them, and property values are rising, rents are increasing, and the artists who actually occupy these spaces are on the verge of having to find more affordable units. In the same way, their municipal infrastructure can't keep up their growth, and they're having problems with traffic, parking, all these things that come with success, but also things that need to be addressed. In Holyoke, we have some different strengths and weaknesses. Holyoke, it has a vibrant Puerto Rican population. Over 50% of their community is Puerto Rican. And this really creates a really wonderful community atmosphere. However, Holyoke struggled economically following the leaving of their manufacturing, which has been hard for Holyoke to regain strength. However, we have this blossoming art scene that's really seeing some movement and providing more affordable spaces compared to the surrounding cities. However, because most of Holyoke's vacant space is in these mill buildings, we see poor building infrastructure, leaking roofs, lack of accessible space, high energy costs that comes with a lot of these different artist studio complexes. Also in Holyoke and in other cities as well, we see the influence of the cannabis industry creating competition for these vacant spaces with artists. We also see some disconnect between artists and the established community just because of the differing demographics. In Northampton, Northampton has a very strong and established cultural scene. Their downtown attracts a lot of music, arts, and the academic. There's Smith College. And this has created a really active community. They support local products and services, and they really value that. However, the artist studio complex in Northampton is pretty separated from the downtown. It's in an area you wouldn't really go unless you're going specifically for the studio building. And the building is in need of repair. It has elevators that break down, accessibility issues, but if so a lot of those repairs were fixed, the price would go up for tenants. So some of the key themes and recommendations, one is the value of artists neighboring artists. Time and time again, every artist interviewed said that the benefit of these spaces was really in the collective community they had and the resources they shared with other artists in the building. Second, the challenges of mill building infrastructure. This was pretty universal throughout all the spaces because these buildings are from the industrial era. We see infrastructure issues due to their immense size and insulation. Next, we have the power of strong municipal arts leadership. In Northampton, and especially in East Hampton, we see specific roles dedicated for arts leadership, and this really makes a difference in the support the artists feel, but also the ability for the community to interact with these spaces in a more welcoming and accessible way. In Holyoke, currently there's no municipal arts leadership, and that's really affected just the vision for the future of the arts in Holyoke. Next, we have the consequences of the cannabis industry. Since the legalization of marijuana in Massachusetts, cannabis stores have been popping up all around, but especially in the Connecticut River Valley. We see stores popping up, especially in vacant spaces, in mill buildings where it's trendy, people like to go to them, but it also has the physical space required to grow and sell these products. So they threat competition to artists also looking at these spaces. And the goal is to incentivize building owners to have reserve or provide space for artists and not just cannabis who can usually pay more per these spaces. Next, we have the threat of gentrification. In East Hampton, this is actually the biggest threat to them right now. Almost every artist interviewed noted that they felt the effects of rising rents and rising property values, and were worried that they would be kicked out of their spaces or couldn't afford them anymore. In Holyoke, this isn't as present, but there's definitely this threat because you have this arts coming up and growing in a community that's mainly lower income residents. Next, we have the complex relationship between existing communities and artists. A lot of artists, especially in Holyoke, express feeling this guilt that they know they were a gentrifying force, but also Holyoke providing the only accessible and affordable artist space that they could have at that time. So you have this dichotomy between trying to get people into these buildings, while also trying to connect with the community. And those, at times, those values may be at odds. Lastly, we have the importance of open studio events. These are really one of the most successful ways to get the public and people who wouldn't usually come into these spaces into artist studio complexes and really see and appreciate the work being done there and make connections between the artists and the greater community. And here's a brief summary of just an artist studio complex toolkit that other cities as well as these cities can use to help support the artists in these spaces, as well as the greater community in making connections between the arts and vibrancy. A few examples, like I mentioned, are open studios, common art space for artists, prioritizing accessibility, cultural districts, incentivizing building owners to rent space to artists, etc. So to conclude, these artist studio spaces definitely serve the artists that occupy space there. They have a community of like-minded people who share resources and just socially, really supportive of their creative process, but also the ability to go into their private studio space and work alone is really important. And for the extent to which these spaces benefit their communities, there's enormous benefit when there's co-conspiracy between artists, policymakers, and the greater community. But if that's not in place, if there's a disconnect between artists and policymakers, or a disconnect between artists and the greater community, you begin to see greater threats of gentrification, greater threats of divisions in needs and assets. But overall, events like open studios and workshops and affordable classes really provide ways to build more vibrant communities out of these spaces. So to conclude, while artist studio complexes represent incredible spaces for innovation and creativity, the benefits to their greater community rest on the development of mutual understandings, effective communication, and collective action between all stakeholders in the city. So thank you so much for listening. Please contact me if you have any questions or comments about my presentation, and I look for have a nice day.